You're reading a magazine, you come across a full-page nude photo of a girl.
Is this testing whether I'm a replicant or a lesbian, Mr. Deckard?
Just answer the questions, please.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
The 1980s started with a clear vision of the future, one filled with lightsabers, space battles, and heroic adventures among the stars. But in 1982, one film dared to show us a different tomorrow, one where the streets were dark, the rain never stopped, and humanity's greatest creation had come back to hunt them. Welcome to Past America, where today we're diving into Blade Runner, the masterpiece that audiences weren't ready for. Picture this. It's 1982. Harrison Ford is the biggest star in Hollywood thanks to Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Ridley Scott is fresh off the success of Alien. Everything's lined up for a blockbuster hit. Instead, they delivered something that would leave audiences confused, critics divided, and studio executives scrambling to understand what went wrong. Blade Runner wasn't just a box office disappointment. It was a financial disaster, barely making back its massive $28 million budget. But sometimes, the most revolutionary films are the ones that audiences just aren't ready for. While E.T. was breaking box office records by showing us a friendly alien visitor, Blade Runner was asking uncomfortable questions about what it means to be human. While other sci-fi films were taking us to pristine space stations, Ridley Scott was showing us a future Los Angeles drowning in acid rain and neon advertisements. The film came at a crucial turning point in science fiction cinema. The optimistic visions of the future that dominated the 70s were giving way to something darker, something that reflected growing fears about corporate power, environmental collapse, and the rise of technology. But Blade Runner didn't just reflect these anxieties, it created an entirely new visual language to express them, a language that would influence every science fiction film that followed. What's fascinating is that while the film was struggling at the box office, something extraordinary was happening behind the scenes. The creative team wasn't just making another movie. They were building tomorrow. Every raindrop, every neon sign, every steam-covered street was crafted with an attention to detail that would set new standards for practical effects. And while audiences of 1982 might not have been ready for this vision, the future was watching. And the future would never be the same. Building tomorrow's noir. When people talk about Blade Runner, they often focus on the story, the philosophy, or Harrison Ford's performance. But what truly set this film apart, what made it revolutionary, was how it looked. Ridley Scott didn't just want to show us the future. He wanted us to feel like we could reach out and touch it. Enter Sid Mead, the visual futurist who would help create the most influential cityscape in science fiction history. Mead wasn't just designing buildings, he was architecting an entire civilization. His concept art showed a world where the past hadn't been replaced by the future. It had been buried under it. Victorian architecture crumbling beneath massive video billboards, Art Deco elevators leading to floating police cars, the classic and futuristic colliding in every frame. What made Mead's work so revolutionary was his attention to the small details. He didn't just design the flying cars. He figured out where they would park, how they would be maintained, what their exhaust would do to the buildings below. Every piece of technology had a purpose, a reason for existing in this world. As Mead himself put it, the future has to be believable, not just fantastic. But designs on paper are one thing. Bringing them to life? That's where Douglas Trumbull and his special effects team came in. Remember, this was 1982. There was no CGI to fall back on. Every towering skyscraper, every flying car, every neon-drenched street had to be built by hand. The team constructed over 700 miniature buildings, some standing over 12 feet tall. The famous Tyrrell Pyramid? That model alone was the size of a small house. The innovation didn't stop with the models. Trumbull's team developed new techniques for lighting and photographing miniatures that had never been seen before. They used a process called forced perspective to make small sets look massive. They invented new ways to create smoke effects that would hang in the air just right. Every shot was a puzzle that had to be solved with pure creativity and engineering skill. Then there's Jordan Cronenweth's revolutionary cinematography. Before Blade Runner, science fiction films typically showed their futuristic worlds in stark, clean lighting. Cronenweth did the opposite. He brought film noir techniques into the future. Hard shadows, smoke effects, and that constant, incredible rain. The rain wasn't just for show. It helped hide the seams between the practical effects and forced light to fracture and reflect in ways that made even simple shots look otherworldly. The film's color palette was equally groundbreaking. Instead of the sterile whites of traditional sci-fi, Blade Runner embraced deep blacks, neon pinks, and smoky blues. Every frame was composed like a painting, with light and shadow carefully balanced to create maximum impact. Cronenweth used what he called high-angle backlighting to create that signature look where characters appear almost silhouetted against the glowing city behind them. And let's talk about those iconic neon signs. Every single one was custom designed and built. The famous Coca-Cola billboard, hand-animated using hundreds of light bulbs. The TDK sign, real neon, carefully bent and shaped to create those futuristic Japanese characters. Even the small street-level signs were crafted with incredible detail, often featuring multiple languages to suggest the cultural mixing of this future world. But perhaps the most incredible thing about Blade Runner's visual style is how it's barely aged a day. While other films from 1982 look hopelessly dated, Blade Runner still feels like a window into tomorrow. That's because Scott and his team weren't trying to predict the future. They were creating a timeless vision of humanity's hopes and fears about what we might become. They built tomorrow's noir, and 4 decades later, we're still living in their shadow. When you look at modern sci-fi films, you can see Blade Runner's DNA everywhere. From Ghost in the Shell to The Matrix, from Altered Carbon to Cyberpunk 2077. They're all children of this visual revolution. Every rain-soaked neon street, every towering corporate headquarters, every mix of old and new architecture, it all traces back to what Scott and his team created in 1982. More human than human. At the heart of Blade Runner lies a question that's more relevant today than ever. What does it mean to be human? And to explore this question, Ridley Scott assembled a cast that would deliver some of the most haunting performances in science fiction history. Let's start with Rutger Hauer as Roy Batty. Here was an actor who understood something profound. He wasn't playing a robot pretending to be human. He was playing a being who might be more human than humans themselves. Every movement, every line delivery was calculated to be just slightly off, yet deeply emotional. Hauer famously rewrote his Tears in Rain monologue, transforming it from a longer script version into those perfect poetic lines that would become cinema history. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. It's not just a death speech, it's a declaration of humanity. Then there's Harrison Ford as Deckard. Fresh off playing heroes like Han Solo and Indiana Jones, Ford gave us something completely different. A noir detective drowning in moral ambiguity. Watch his scenes with Sean Young's Rachel carefully. This isn't the confident Ford we knew from Star Wars. This is a man questioning everything he thought he knew about what makes us human. The famous retirement scenes, where Deckard hunts down replicants, aren't played as heroic moments. They're tragic, brutal, and leave our protagonist increasingly haunted. Sean Young's performance as Rachel deserves special attention. The scene where she discovers she's a replicant is a masterclass in subtle acting. Watch her face as the realization hits. Every micro-expression tells the story of her world falling apart. Yet even as she questions her own humanity, Rachel displays more genuine emotion than many of the film's human characters. Daryl Hannah brought an otherworldly physical presence to Pris, the basic pleasure model who proves to be anything but basic. Her gymnastics background allowed her to perform many of her own stunts, creating movements that seemed just inhuman enough to be unsettling. The scene where she runs away from Deckard through the corridors of Sebastian's apartment is both beautiful and terrifying. And we can't forget Edward James Olmos as Gaff, a character who says more with origami than most actors say with pages of dialogue. His cryptic paper creations serve as a Greek chorus throughout the film, commenting on the action and raising questions about Deckard's own identity. What makes these performances so special is how they work together to blur the line between human and replicant. The humans often seem cold and mechanical, while the replicants burn with passion and desire for life. When Roy Batty cries for his fallen companions, or gently kisses his maker before killing him, is he not displaying the most human of emotions? When Deckard mechanically retires replicants, who's really the machine? Modern audiences watching the film for the first time might be surprised by how little traditional action there is. That's because the real drama isn't in the chase scenes or fights. It's in these incredible performances, each one adding another layer to the film's central. Question about the nature of humanity. And in an age where AI is no longer science fiction, these performances feel more relevant than ever. Lost in Time. Here's something most people don't know about Blade Runner. The movie you think you've seen might not be the movie that actually exists. You see, Blade Runner isn't just one film. It's many films, each version telling a slightly different story, each one changing how we understand this complex universe. Let's start with what audiences saw in 1982. The theatrical cut came with something that both Harrison Ford and Ridley Scott hated: a film noir-style voiceover narration. The studio, worried that viewers wouldn't understand the plot, forced Ford to record these explanatory monologues. You can actually hear the frustration in Ford's voice. He deliberately performed them as flat as possible, hoping they wouldn't be used. But they were. And this version also got saddled with a bizarrely optimistic ending that felt completely out of place. Then, in 1992, something incredible happened. A work print version of the film was accidentally shown at a Los Angeles theater. This version had no voiceover, no happy ending, and subtle differences throughout that changed the entire meaning of the story. Fans went crazy for it. This accident led to the release of the director's cut in 1992. But here's the twist. Ridley Scott didn't actually supervise this cut. While it removed the voiceover and happy ending and added the crucial unicorn dream sequence, it wasn't quite Scott's true vision. That had to wait until 2007, when the final cut was released. This is the version Scott had complete control over, and the changes are fascinating. The violence is more graphic, the visual effects are enhanced, and continuity errors are fixed. But most importantly, this version fully commits to the film's most controversial idea, that Deckard himself might be a replicant. The evidence is there in every version, but the final cut makes it impossible to ignore. These different versions don't just represent studio interference or directors' preferences, they fundamentally change the philosophical questions at the heart of the film. Is Deckard human or replicant? Is his love for Rachel real or programmed? The answer changes depending on which version you watch. It's like the film itself is a replicant with memories that might or might not be real. And here's the really mind-bending part. These multiple versions have actually enhanced the film's themes about memory, identity, and what makes us human. Just as Deckard questions what's real in his world, viewers have to question which version of the film is real. When Rachel discovers her memories are implants, we might ask ourselves, which version of Blade Runner do we actually remember? Today, all these versions exist simultaneously, like parallel universes of the same story. And just like the replicants in the film, each version is fighting for the right to exist, to be considered real. In a way, Blade Runner became a meta-commentary on its own themes of authenticity and memory. Want to start a heated debate among sci-fi fans? Just ask them which version of Blade Runner is the real one. But maybe that's missing the point. Maybe, like the film's central question about what makes us human, there isn't one simple answer. Like tears in rain. Some movies predict the future, others shape it. Blade Runner did both. Here we are, 4 decades later, and this film's fingerprints are everywhere, not just in movies and games, but in how we imagine our own future, and maybe how we're actually building it. Look at any modern city at night. The massive video advertisements covering buildings in Times Square or Shibuya. Pure Blade Runner. The discussions about AI rights and consciousness. Blade Runner asked those questions first. Our fears about corporate power over society. Blade Runner showed us that dystopia before we were living in it. Even the way we talk about artificial intelligence, the term replicant has become shorthand for humanoid AI right alongside Asimov's robots. But what makes Blade Runner truly prophetic isn't its technology, it's its humanity. In 1982, the idea of empathizing with artificial beings seemed absurd. Today, we're having serious debates about AI sentience, digital consciousness, and machine rights. Roy Batty's final monologue hits differently in a world where AI is writing poetry and creating art. I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Now we have to ask, what will our creations see? What memories will they fight to preserve? The film's visual influence is impossible to overstate. Cyberpunk as a genre? Blade Runner wrote the visual dictionary. That mix of high-tech and low-life, of neon and noir, of ancient and futuristic. It all starts here. From Akira to The Matrix, from Ghost in the Shell to Altered Carbon, from Cyberpunk 2077 to the actual streets of modern Shanghai. They're all speaking the visual language that Blade Runner invented. Even the way the film was made has proven prophetic. Those practical effects, built with such painstaking detail, they've aged better than many CGI films from decades later. In an age where audiences are growing tired of obvious computer graphics, Blade Runner's handcrafted future feels more real than ever. Modern filmmakers are returning to practical effects, following the path this film blazed 40 years ago. But perhaps Blade Runner's greatest legacy is how it changed what science fiction could be. Before this film, science fiction was largely seen as escapist entertainment. Blade Runner showed that the genre could ask profound questions about what it means to be human, about memory, identity, and consciousness. It proved that science fiction could be art of the highest order. Today, as we stand on the brink of an AI revolution, as our cities grow more crowded and corporate power more absolute, as the line between human and machine grows blurrier, Blade Runner doesn't feel like science fiction anymore. It feels like a documentary filmed in a future that's almost here. And maybe that's why the film has endured. It's not just a vision of tomorrow, it's a mirror showing us who we are today. Like those moments Roy Batty described, Blade Runner won't be lost in time. It's become part of our cultural memory, our shared vision of the future, and perhaps our roadmap to tomorrow. The real question is, are we ready for the future it predicted? If you enjoyed this deep dive into Blade Runner, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us which version of the film is your favorite. And stay tuned. We've got more hidden sci-fi gems to explore here on Past America.